Pension Dembre. What did it? Tangiba did it, Wakasra. Tungela, they are Zimbe Chingilo. Tungela, they are Zimbadelo Chingilo, Tempatelia, took to a tension took to a. Oh, Dima Banji shake to a.
Yes. So we're starting this section. If you look on the outline on page 308, we're starting the section, which is the second part of the third section here, and it reads, showing it is erroneous to think of suffering as pleasure.
That is true. Na tambu to shake to a. Tambu kadasana. Chishimba la teor shimba mirik pasero. Chishimba. Shishimba delia, Ale Tare Samsange, Shimbake, the Mirikbares, Shinshashio Maris.
So there's 6 parts, and it begins with this 39th verse, the meaning of which is inappropriateness of considering the process of dying pleasurable.
No, that is some words, no? Taking that with the Kotawadan Danos, Midi. Devadan Dano Sigduati Sonda, and Devadan Semba Yore, Shenasigora, with it, Devadan Semba Kayo Mari Chishimbe Kansatelia, and Devar Shimbate, Mirikbares, Deatelia, Chishin la, 2 Songshensra, draw down and draw your nase, Chishin Bane, Tejurshe, Nambakundu Rigmayes. Duchi sometimes the Kokeshilea and Jigduban Zujan Rese. They are Nikichi, Devada Tada Maumbe to Sumbalco, Jigijin to Yoresa. Chishimbala, Nashiko, Gakshimbam, Jigshimbam, Chishimba, Chishimbala, Tusonshe, Tadarian draw at an Chidia, and draw Guna, Chishimbala, Devar, Guru, number Kunduripa minus. Oh, Tandako, Garazo Chivalepa, Tanya near do a Chideg. Some generation of Cotondulia, social children condo, de Giora, Coshisal no de Giora. O Teliaco, Tinibarutella, the Washinake or Maresgora.
So it's starting with the assertion or where somebody is saying or thinking, since the expression Devadatta has pleasure is used, pleasure does exist. And so what's going to be shown here is that pleasure, how can you call the process of dying pleasurable? So the verse reads, when you have spent, are spending, and will spend time dying, it is not at all proper to call the process of dying pleasurable. Composite things, read the commentary, composite things by nature disintegrate moment by moment. Furthermore, this is true with regard to the 3 times, the past, present, and future. It's a ongoing process over time. When you have therefore already spent, are spending, and will spend time disintegrating and dying, it is not at all proper to call the process of dying pleasurable.
Chalamambu maps. Tatineko Yanga, Koyabuche Shache, Shari Usuche, Dineko Tanda, Bushida, Mavsura, Chima. Teach the Chenda de Koyabudelia, oh, that you pay, Nebe, Kiran, Tende Mavsuna, Tanda, Subsoje, Yabuche Shavi. Kirtani, Cheba, Mission gets to a pie, whichever the mission gets to us. Love it. Oh, they love the coach, so Tanda alumni. Oh, Kiraning, I to whichever the Tanda, Yishi, and Yishi, and Kirangali Yishi, Kirang near Kancha, but the mission, but a Cheba mission by Kiraris, Sulab, Dinesh.
So then the householder accused a bad servant who kept spoiling his things of ingratitude. here the idea in an example, and the idea is that the servant, the bad servant, had always been ruining the things of the householder who he served. So then he accused him, saying, "You're always you're a very stupid person to always be ruining my things. You ruined them in the past. You're still ruining today. You'll be ruining them again in the future." Then the servant replied, "It's you who is really stupid. How could you waste your time, your actions, just trusting me?" So he turned it around and threw it back at his boss. Yeah.
다 니바디 레도와 두그나네 니바디 셰도와 디카르스네 네심발라 대와심바 메리바스 소소레 네바겐게 마부지게 신도네 코디 대와 네바레스 라비요 마레스고라 네심발라 대와심바 야야네 대와레 삼제 신샤치기요 마레스고라 오 디카르스네 샤야 동엘라 대와심바 메리바탈세 오 가레스네 정말 되네 심바 손자 대 동해와래 들이야 대화심바 메리레세 어디야 류젠 남라 제소게 네바타도 여기르나 네심바네 대오셰 에네 나바군도 릭마인세 뭐데레 류젠 정말 미상마데 류젠 상마 탐절이야 제바다 꼼바소게 네바데 에네 되다도 고 여여바레스기와라 동해지 규되네 네심바레스 동해 규 네바친게 고 여여바레스기와라 어디인데 딜야네 남바군도 리그바 멤버십 데 대화레 삼상 남바군도 레기마레 셈프레 Oh.
So then this next verse 40 speaks about the inappropriateness of considering being afflicted pleasurable. So here, while we're constantly being harmed or afflicted by something, then how could we then consider that pleasurable? So when it's still in answer to the above assertion, when beings, if they read the verse here, when beings with bodies are constantly afflicted by hunger and so forth, it is not at all proper to call being afflicted pleasurable. So our bodies are constantly afflicted by things like hunger, thirst, and so forth. And so then how could we possibly be calling that pleasurable?
너지 망부지 여신바들라 강에 땡게 망부지 여신발이야 대화를 신배 소소 야구 인삼제 신자제 빼들이야 되도 앞에나 남아카지기 김기왕 된도 내려 대제배 동에 와르 규르자 대화를 넘바신도스 남아 정바실 파포무 바 넘바로 아이나 된도네 코디 나게 왕자대 차장을 톱나 내가 참망아 지규라나 삼기로와 ene ko wanje sama topsone dale ga mambo shidavre neji da kale shidavre ine mo kale samge wa maro tanga ya ko yin sam wangja kanga topso sam o dina shides ga
so it's talking about how can we then be attached to something that's causing us harm and thinking that it's pleasurable. And so there's a example is of the new wife who wanted to have control of the household. She wanted to be in power, and then when she did, she had all these responsibilities and difficulties and so forth. But she just disregarded all the difficulties and trouble that she had to go through, and just thought of it as happiness. Oh
yeah, that is somebody that took na somebody. Tata bo ne mitwen ba tuma dui ba la tawar shimba miribas. Tata mitwen ba mabu shibu nyam do yona. Ano ko tebo da kibu yimba yin samne shenja shiba miribare sa. O dina she ano ngara zo e sobon de le sigara. Oh tene jongwa shi sa chu me lung che o te zu te ne sa ge pa tembar che chu lembar che ya da me pa kambo so ya da lung ge ni chi pa to re ya da chi ki o te de chawa me thun ba mang bu chi chen ge so bu ya tu da to ne de yo re su wa ra o te le ya ne ta te war shen ne Dar Shambati Rigmar Kaduna Social Neva Jung de Yor, Nuji Yode Yorisugara. O Nuba Meben Jungun Lasse. Junga Saju Melon Ravichigi, Social Sobutu Nuba Yomaris. They do Neva Meben, Junga Samatam just Sony, and a social lady took Yorisura. Sobashi, take your days, Luke. The Saju Melon Junga Ship de Pensione, Chawajada de Con Gava Reswara. Oh, Chigi Partene. Sakbar chigi ore, chigi pa chudigi, lamba sogu ore, chigi saba sogu, chigi atamo sogu ore, o tinashi lungi pa torgu ore, o ne ya kashe sun zimbar chegu ore, tende gawa namla teo she, namba kundu mirik sose, sosogi be, lui nali ya be, penzu chawa cheba, mitun ba chigi jile nechi yungengi, mambu jin duyu de be shindu, danga tanda tebo yinsa lomba cheba de rigmare sudwa.
So then this next verse talks about so number 3 here, inappropriateness of considering pleasurable a composite of various incompatible factors, which is like an enemy. So here it's talking about the 4 elements within our body. Each one of these elements then has a function that is in fact contrary to the function of the other elements. So they're in constant disagreement with each other. So how could you call that kind of experience pleasurable? Though powerless, the combining of all the elements produces the body. Thus, it is not at all proper to call what is incompatible pleasurable. So powerless here means that each one of the elements by itself is not able to produce the body, but by combining together, these elements do produce the body. However, each one of them has an individual function. Like one is to heat, and one is to cool, and one is to disperse, and one is to bring together, and so they're in constant contradictory modes of functioning. So how could you call such a collection of incompatible functioning features as pleasurable?
That is pedale do. Pedale penaba takbar chigi be ya pa su che ta ni bu che simjen to ta shan de sigora. Ta da che ne jangu che ne tu che ne dap cha chu din de che ne rida che chu sin sreba o di tuk da de ko lenji du nyam do sa ta ni bu ta chi sha ne chigi chil kyon je ma sa ko de deve Devar Shimbati Rigmedo Atina Sheres, Mitumbe Shibujin Jumaji Luna Sote, Kaduinako, Chigichilia, Chamanyam, Nujin Jung Shingiris,
The example is of provide an analogy for this is as it can be no pleasure when a horse, jackal, snake, bird, deer, and crocodile are confined together. I think they're all kept up within a tied. They're kind of like corralled into a roped enclosure, and they're all kept together.
Oh yeah, that's Shibadire. Shibade Karsudosana, Lag Shimbala, Devar Shimba Miribase, Neji Mambuchi, Yuni, Tigipa, Sosu Meba, so on never Geshe Batelia, and it there some condition but Rigma. Oh, Tigaresne, Sawada, Tawala, Sovatachi, Charbala, Sova Shan, Chinuchi Mambuchiko, Yeshe to Tigichi Metewa, I'll never chase in Balia. The Casura, Deva in Samsa, Deva Samsa, Shembarigma. Transfer Namla Chirchuba, Sedwa, Tadu Yoba Mayena, say, Tamuda Savala Soba, Neji, Lusimla Neji to Kanga Tadupa, Subject never top Chimbuchi Yoba Maris Gora, Chirchuba Tatu Yoba Mayenas, a large in Bane Deoshe, number going to read my essay, or Neji Tedage, and a Sosoge. Neji, Dedage, Sosolia, Lula Soba Tedala, Nene, Lagbam, the Atimeba Soshin Batelia, and the Tabu Samsung Shaja, but the River Mares.
So in the next verse, the fourth point here is inappropriateness of considering being destroyed pleasurable. So the this verse then says, when there is never that which will relieve cold and so forth, it is not at all proper to call being destroyed pleasurable. So this is how is talking about how our bodies then are always subject to cold and heat and other extreme harm from the elements. So then when we're always being battered by these elements, then how can we call that pleasurable?
And me mambo ko teje chaba ke joba ke dikise ko teje do ko beje do yore koliatene neje pajo sujo kanga ni yede dawar lomya ko ga yo maro adi na shere semra.
So it's like a band of thieves harried with nooses and sticks will find no comfort. They don't have any opportunity to exaggerate that. Oh, this is a great situation, because they're constantly pursued by those with nooses and sticks and so forth.
Moya, this is what Mo Jigdana and Leji, Debushadu, Kibushadu, say, and Leji, Debush, Kibush, Neda, who said, Tende Tanyan do Asigora. Tiyuzanko, the Waran by your Basana. Oh, Dene, the Waran by your mother, Tukadu Inako, Kale Kamne, Tubekone, and Chasing Balasa. Ne Dubi Konesora, Kale Jabada, Kale Kaya to the Legation Batalia, and it Tawarshin Barigma Residua. Oh, Candidacy, Bezu Mebar, Chebashe, Shanga, Sadi Yumenasa. O Luda Sem Yukon Bezuch and Kale Majavache, Nia Davuchina ko Tune, Luda Semliachi, Nia to the Bezuche Guadesa. And then draw at Duba and La Soba Chulam Karina ko Bezu Majavalia, Lumbena Yoma Resiora. What they doing near to the legislation Balakaduyana, Kale Kaya, Tende. Legacy chasing but resting also. Caleta Cabezu, she de Cochi de Ura, or de Teliane, Tower, you know, say she number Kundurik Legi Tower, you know, she number Kundumic sauce.
So the fifth one is inappropriateness of considering the doing of tiring actions pleasurable. So here, the assertion is, since conventionally one uses the expression Devadatta is lying down comfortably, real pleasure does exist. And but the idea is that in any action that we do, it takes some exertion. So how could, when we have to make exertion, how could that be real pleasure. So when on earth no action is done without exertion, it is not at all proper to call performing actions pleasurable. So there's nothing, whether we're lying down or walking or sitting and so forth, whether it's mental or physical exertion that we can do without, nothing that we can do without, nothing is done without mental or physical exertion. And how can we call that pleasurable? Rasa?
No, yeah. Jezako kale kaya da ngeshi duba. Tende lega che shimbatele che shimbatele ane karsore. Tewar deba mirwe pedele yongdwa. Pena dadreba la sobe kembo nge sirwe kebu se tadu duba shinos. Kebu se tuzule ko mahumbane yabu yone tondalea ane chanson kike ngazi cheche. Zindad masu tendro tali yigi lapchu tendro ane si lapchu tendro ane karsore si kyangya da tende lapchu o tenjo do maa kyangya da tende lapchu ko zinda chik sasun chilindro ko kale kaaje kale kyabje ngeshi dube che tegu doa tewar teba seke me doa tina shiresi doa.
So then the idea is that we're always involved in doing some kind of actions that require our exertion. So how could that be pleasurable? And the example then is of a prince with 5 tutors of different topics or subjects, such as grammar is always miserable. The idea being that when he's finished studying one topic like crafts, then he has to take up another topic immediately. One of his rishi, I guess they're like rishis, his tutors, then instructs him in some other topic like grammar and so forth. So there's never any moment's rest for him. And so how could that be pleasurable?
Oh yeah. Ta chukba de redwa chukba de ka redo sena ne tawa mena tewe tendo tunge nyowa metebe tawa trube chedu tunge nyowa yobe tawa yore sigora tawa membe ransen bache mena tawa de toya tendala kale kepje tunge yona kale kepje ne tende chigdwa te tawa ransen ba yore sena sigordo samna o tene tawa chungse ge tendo tunge ge gyu Trubala, Tawar Shimba. Tawa Chunjun Toya Tundalia, Soso Kale Jim Tunge Manguchi, Trub Devatelia, Tawar never said to Gumares Sigora. Oh, Tawar never Shenchachi Rigimares Sigora. Oh, did I send to Danine, Tadu Dile, Suarcha, Nando Yena, Tawa shed number could do ring my essay. Keba Maimba to Tawa Chunse Tundaliane, Tiba Mangusaje, and Sendelia, Chiva, Chini, Kiwachima, Penjang, Sung Tungel, so the Mambu Yungu Resguara. Did I send to Daniel Tado, Tessonza, Keba Yena, did send it Kiwa Shando, and the Nekar, so Daniel Tungame Shadow, Tado, Tigbele, Suarchaco, Residua. Oh, Yando Yona, Devashe, number going to Miriso say. Keba Namne, Tawan de send it and Shando, Daniel Tado, Tigbe, you change it to Tungele Suarchaco Grace. As a Meke Bene, Leche Ben, Jebu telling has only sober, or Tindate in it, Tunga number Kundu, Nyongureti, Riba Mahin Suda.
So, the assertion in this next verse, the 44th verse, is if there were no pleasure, it would not be feasible to experience suffering for the sake of pleasure. But since suffering for pleasure's sake is seen, pleasure does exist. Here in the topical outline it says, inappropriateness of considering pleasurable the creation of the causes of suffering for the sake of a little pleasure. So here the commentary states the unwise do ill deeds for the sake of a little pleasure. and as a result experience such sufferings as being put to death in this life and bad rebirths later in their future lives. Since the wise want happiness, they should always, in this and other lives, guard against suffering caused by ill deeds. When there are bad rebirths resulting from actions done by the unwise for the sake of pleasure, calling them pleasurable is not at all proper. So the injunction here is then to always guard yourself against doing any ill deeds. Wow.
This way. Oh yeah, that is pedal sigma. Oh, then to Tadune, subsequent pedalia, Pena Macho Jube, Talase, Trabe, Kagasalionja, Hamagoje, the Yongi Dengang Tadele to Tadune, Jiba Yusane, Telepe subsequent Sungi de Basera. What in a singarajo, Chendi, the Wachung Sellers of Tendit and Dalia, Tigbasayatilla, best subsequent Sungo race.
So the example in this case is of an unknown enemy. You don't know when the enemy is going to come, what's going to happen, when they're going to come to harm you. So then you guard against the unknown enemy, who is then a constant source of fear. We're always aware that of guarding against doing ill deeds, so that we won't receive harm in the future as a result.
Oh yeah, that is some version that Sumba. Tawa don't never namla, so Tawa don't get cancer to visit. And then Lamga Tarim Bushin Dovina, so come down to the lower color, some Jenny, Tata Lambuda, Modadam, Namdula, so what condition to do Asigora. You mean it, Tata Lambuso, Shane, Doatoe. Titawa, your uncle did you with the Kandan Ready Yushane, Talishan, the Motal and Ready Chigi or Basigora. You did the one on by your Sena, Samna, Tower on Semba Union to Shenjachi, but Miri Desigora. Shemba Sola, Tower on Semba Yoma Res, Yora. Shemba Sola, Tower on Sembachi, Yoma Res. They can do Shemba Sola, Minamji, Tower to Yomin, they say. Oh, Tambur Kangla, Someba, Tela Tarbe Kala, you say. Tala Shemba Chinako, Yuri and Rosonet, Tunga Pecale, or Resgora. Tindi Tambune could do a Chunju man, and Chemaya Pelli, or Takaleshida do Tamasha, Kandan on the Castle, some sort of date in Yorda, or Tinde Yungmares, Tindi Tezule, Tungate, Tambune Chunju, or the Togi or Marete in a church and donate down Tungachambu Yungu Waswater.
So, here we have the beginning of what's the, well, no, it's just the third of these three sections on refuting the existence of real pleasure, and it's the assertion here is that one sees that those who intent on pleasure ride horses and elephants, considering it a discomfort to walk on their own 2 feet. Therefore, pleasure does exist. We could say also riding in a car. There is, so what the meaning of this verse is, as stated by the outline, is from the start, there is no real pleasure in riding and so forth. So the verse states, there is never any pleasure for humans in riding and so forth. How can that which at the start does not begin, in the end, increase? So, here, that on examining accepted causes of pleasure, one finds that right from the start, slight discomfort is beginning. So then how could we call that pleasurable?
Yeah, did Tashambala Sobada Shayadine, Sayada Tenichi, Sadunchi, Zemuchi, Karilega Karina. Oh, Tambune Zamduneko, 동해 충주지 요아레스 거라 유ring 부채서는 그 아다 칼카 두도와 어디에 당분에 실고 동해 충주지 매매네 디펠제 첨부래 요 말레스 요라 어디에 그 대대 그래가 컨디션에 그 대화를 셴바데 셴자체도 그 말레스
So
디페들다 디페들이야 기불름부시 밤에 쿠르게 체테바세베 귤 셈바시노스 다디 세범에도 대수면도 밤마르지 쿠라를 발르를 체가를 샤제 어디서 세르실라 대코삼노 오다 저거 다일 딘디바시 우르사 딱바시고 체가데 세제 동행양대 수르시기세레
So then
Sela sobanro ajanja mai bashanda lega karina sigwara tambune tunge chunju jiwara karse yoru buchana ko kala kadu do kanga
so the idea is that in the beginning of anything that we undertake it's there's a little suffering that time and then it will increase the more we do it so it's saying that whatever we do, it could be riding, eating, drinking, playing, all of these things, if done to excess, only become painful. So how could something which at the start was not a beginning of, how could something which at the start was not a beginning of pain, in the end increase and become intense pain? So then, that which in the start was a small incipient cause of pain is then mistaken for pleasure. So it's the example is of a fool who thinks the last half of the ladle of his parents' fried bread will his parents are always saying, okay, you can finish off the half that we left you there, and then so he was always just thinking that half a ladle is plenty for me, but how could that satisfy his hunger? Shiba
jigdenba nam 동해 칠주지 서로 심발라 대화 랑셈바 셴바스 뭐들에 동해 칠주베 규생 동해도 봐 답시전에 봐 매버서야 도와서요라 디데코 대화 랑셈바 요레 삼나서요라 예베 텔신자리 그랬으나 아니 jigdenba nam 동해 칠주지 서로 심발라 대화 랑셈바 셴바 메리 되서요라 근데 서전에도 교발라 제달 가시 가교르바 대신 동에 실주라 더 냠도 셈바르시에세 배나 추분 가시스기도 서전에도 다 낭미치체 낭미니 추부체 니 요부치 요부 교부체 또 건조 나자르치 만드니 교과교고야 샤로 되니고 전다데 추부시다 순자 서전에다 된데돌 교과교고야 지부데 자만도 창교르지 텔러시 루체 디나 교과교고야라 어디데 추분가시 내도 교과 사이 내도 교과 통네 교과라 대화 매버 켜바 매제데 교과교고야래 칼레칸 기칼라 만든 교과교고를 네가 대화게 요 말와 동해레 되어라 고 동해레 되어라 이나 추부데 삼교야래 다네 왕자다니치 벤저 표선 소바 손자 네 저바오 냠도 지다르 추부 가시 가와르교가 되셔 온가 너제든데 날 쪽이와래 나 벤저 야부 손자 야부래 부디디 야부디 든데네 교도 왔음 교가 들레고 대화다 야부에 삼자야고 신자기와라 동해 실주봐 슈충우 소외 내갑기 서로 심발라 랑셈베 대화 손에 대오 냠도 sembarcheba yenge tawarang semba medos otikora namdoge tindeje sembarcheba remado tawangone jike yo maruko jugo jute yorate niga kale yora
so here in verse 46 then is the assertion that pleasure caused by the alleviation of pain exists. And the topical outline explains this verse as covering how ordinary people think of the feeling of satisfaction from alleviated pain as real pleasure. So thinking the alleviation of, as the verse reads, thinking the alleviation of pain is pleasure, is like someone who feels delight vomiting into a gold pot. The idea is there of both a rich man who's and his servant have gotten some kind of illness together, and they're vomiting, and the rich man is using a golden pot, and the servant, who's not a rich man, a poor man, is vomiting into a clay one. But then they're equally unpleasant. They're both vomiting together. So the rich man is thinking, oh, he's feeling delighted when he sees the other one vomiting, because he says, oh, I have great wealth and power, and look, I can vomit into a golden pot. But in fact, it's they're both. They're both. In fact, he's constantly miserable because he's vomiting into he's vomiting constantly. So and he's only sort of making it up in his mind that this is something that this is something good and pleasurable, that what he's doing. So it's like that.
No, yeah, that is pedal. Oh, pedalia. Bena Nime Duni, Timalandu, Nimat Signi, Shada Chawachim Sixona, and he shingo Timnarajil Tesona, Sibuchinal Tesona, Echo, Sigbe Dungedi, Chungse, Shu Chungya Kabi, Sora Delia, Ataya, which on some socialism in Pembe Sydney Gorba. They go Dunga Chirchube. Soaris Rediora, Devaridiora, not to make Chirju Devashe Chalas. Sabe Yembeta, Devati Daga Degmare, could the Timnal Dash at Devataga Dev Degmare. Sabe Dagin Dung Nima Salvache, Dunga Depa, Shuk the Machur Chinsasuna, and go Tamu and Gotsuche, and go Tamul Deni Madruche, Nimadruni to Hurva. The Shu Yamata, Tave Dunga and Gotsube, Dunga Ye maybe Soa, Missibe. Dunga saw and maybe. Swaji Yomar Congo said the way you might Macalicalicene, the European Soyako, Tungengo to the Yorton Swa conditioner. Or into Missibe. Judembe Soa Tungeni, a day shiri Soa Devashu Chungu Zamia, Gomia, Soa Tungetelia, Devaji Cheche di Tungegin Yurgumare. Oh, Devade, and it Tamadelia, Tango Deva in a Chima. Tungengo Jundu to Asgora. The Najik Demba Namlia, Tungerang Semba Yola, Devarang Semba Mes, your racer.
So the example here is of, in the middle of the first paragraph of the commentary on this verse, then, for instance, the feeling of satisfaction as the pain of being burnt somewhat decreases when one moves out of the scorching sun into the shade is called the pleasure of alleviated pain. But the suffering of cold begins as soon as the discomfort of heat diminishes. So, thus there is no pleasurable sensation entirely free from discomfort, because the discomfort is beginning right at the very time that you move into the discomfort of cold is beginning right at the very time you move into the shade. Since ordinary people or worldly people's pain does not require even a weak pleasurable feeling as a basis in relationship which is in relation to which it is established, it is said that ordinary people have real suffering, but no real pleasure.
No, yeah, that and I. the Dawarang Samba Yo Maris, Shed, Chidan, Soa Koe, Soa Dewa Yo Maris, Yo Maris. Oh, they came on the wrong Martinet that they were doing a Namsha Yo, the Telekundim Dugres. Oh, Penata, and this some Tangurson. Penangombo de Servo da Tinanda, Mabu da Tinanda, Carida Tinando, Carina Gombo Ranch de Yoresguara. Oh, that Rimbu Sarajena, Rimbu de Corale, Ring which lesson called Tunguchadua. Oh, didn't I say, so Devade, Kajanji Sonsonoko, Deva Mother Dungere Dugua, Judua. So Dungedico, Dungeraja, Gujin de Sanzambado, Dungeraja de Gdua. Oh, didn't I say this, Yora?
So here, the commentary points out that we're not, that it's incorrect to assert that nominally pleasure does not exist, for that would be to deny fact. We're not refuting that pleasure does exist conventionally or nominally. The difference should be understood as illustrated by the following analogy. Even when blue and yellow are juxtaposed, the perception of blue as blue and not as yellow arises. Whereas when a long thing is placed beside a much longer one, the perception of it as short arises. So this is the idea here, not to confuse that the real suffering does exist and is clear, but real pleasure does not exist. It's just a relative, what do you say, a relative perception. Morales.
That's right. Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Don't know about it. Dawarang Samba maybe Jusen Shanda Yan Shegdo. Dawarang Samba maybe Jusen Shanda Shegdo. Dinner Tatang Butere. Oh, Tunge Chungune, Tambune Tunge Chungune, Zambe, Tunge Chembo, Shen, Dogbar Tonvese. Oh, Tunge Chungune, Zambe, Tunge Chembo, Shen, Dogbar Tonve, Dawarang Samba, you were Mendudia, or Disam Giora. Garsure. Tunge Chungune, somebody, and the Tunge Chamber de Condo to ask you, Dogbar Tongue, Dawarang Samba, you have Mendu Days, Mendu Banese. Then Dawa Yodese, Tragba Chin, Tragba Nibar, Kuru Potion, Tela, Teve, Lonjunga Tabute, Dawa Mena, Te Mebon Washigo Shenas, Takarsik Dosena. Tunge Chungune Zambe, and it Tunge Chambo Dogba Dog do Asgora, Tunge Chunguchi Tapsi and the Tunge Chambo the Mavre do Resore. This was a quote, they were on Sembade, Yore Samna, de Tunge Chungu Samne, Chambo Mava de Tunge on Seba, you have a truth to Mares or whatever. Canderesna, or Kaji Garsore, they were on Seba Yore, sing at the castle, they were Yode, Tragba Chin, Tragba Nibar. Kuru Poshi, Tela Tevelo, Jua Tabute, Tewa Mena, Te Mebo Ashigushnas, or Kotsula Gudwa. Tewa Chunguchi, Dunga Chunguchi, Dunga Chambush and Meva Sudi, Telia Devaran Samba Sigures were. Devaran Samba Mana, they could the day Kidu Kalakasuna, so Puja the Pugmar was were. So Puja the boy at Deco, Devaran Samba Chiesa, and Dekan Yusa, De Shadune. Dawarang Samba together, Shaggy or Desigua. I didn't matter what the Shagara,
Well, so here on the 47th verse, then, we're showing the other reasons why there is no real pleasure. And real pleasure's existence is part of there's two parts to this. And the first one, then, this verse, covers real pleasure's existence is not established by seeing slight incipient pain stop intense pain. So here the assertion is that pleasure does exist because when, for instance, one moves a load from one shoulder to the other, a sense of pleasure arises. if there were no pleasure, one wouldn't move it. They wouldn't even bother to move it. So then this is refuted in the following verse and commentary.
This one.
No, do so.
Oh yeah. Tate de pa karsure. Sambe kebe dogyur na sigara. Tunge zomba dechi yose. Dechi tube kinji da tunge yeshe sungba nyam sigdwa. Tene sambe kebe dogyur na se yayin pa pene tunge chibudin dogdu disigora. Tunge zomba dechi yose sabaji zomgi yore delia. Chunju tanda hamago tunge sabon goston bore te sonza telia te orang zemba chi yudi yo mare sigora. Te sonza tuba sanje chumden dege kitu san ko tunge ke bare gandu de tunge jingandu arese sungba tanda tere samgudu sonre.
So the verse reads, by beginning it stops the produced. How can pain that begins be pleasure? It seems that subduer therefore said both birth and cessation are suffering. So how can you assert that the beginning of being where suffering is small? How can you say that that's pleasure?
Kerwe tunge chenpo pelwa na sigdwa yombar pore sigora tenya dambu ne tunge chungu tsambe se yombar putu sa tunge me mar tunge chungu ne go tsamge ware sigora nga de tunge chenpo keban dobar jura tsamdu sege sujo de tunge chenpo yobaten dobar tsamre sigora tenya tunge meba minasa sujo pe de tunge meba mare sigora tunge sarba shen tsomba laya dewa chi sen dingol dipa chenpo de meba sen de tunge saba go tsu sa re sigora Deliani Teorang Semba Yose, Maris Teorang Semba Maris, Titunge Chungo Yores, Somba Chi de Tunge Chembo, Gag Shembaya, and Gag Shembo Tunge Chembo, the Nengag Batela, Tawake Yomare, Dine de Yore, Tunge Chunjun go to Yore, Tele, Tawayomare, Teorang Semba Kaike Yomaris, Kiwana, this was a co. Tambo de ko tunge kora ti yore ngado de tunge de ngado rese te kewana ya tunge gashi ngagbe tewo nyamdo miriso teleata dewa rangsemba yore nyamdo regima rese ora tesir toba sanje chumdende kadayanen dole songshase kadayana se pukewana ya tunge kona kewo se Gagbanaya tunge kona sakje nyelengi pungbula soba tidwe tunge girang shinchen kere gandu de tunge rang shinche kona gandu rese she sung nyamde zomba bo rangye je tedar semshe ba o konge tinde kongu yesung shasere o dijin de she jamne yamudo hakle.
So the commentary is clear on this point. When the discomfort of carrying a load on the right shoulder for a long time becomes intense and one moves it onto the left one, it is merely that a slight pain which is beginning stops the intense pain already produced, not that there is no discomfort at all. Okay, so how can there be pleasure while a new and different pain is beginning, or while intense pain is stopping? So there's two sources of pain going on, and you're calling that pleasurable. How could that be? There's the old one sort of dying out on the right shoulder, and there's the new one beginning on the left shoulder. So how can you call that pleasurable? So then with this in mind, there's a statement by the Buddha where although one takes birth, some forms of suffering stop. When one takes birth, some forms of suffering stop. It is inappropriate to regard that as pleasure. So this particular sutra where the Buddha is advising Katyayana, the Buddha said, when Katyayana's son is born, only suffering is born. Also, when he ceases, only suffering ceases. So you can understand this through the analogy of the carrying of a load. Well,
yeah, that 동해 첨부 동해 추로와 동해 충우지 고참배 동해 첨부되는 각바들이야 도와랑 셈바 요 말에서 충은 각바들이 요 말에 첨부 각바들이 요 말에 충은 고참부들이 요 말에서라.
Yeah, so this is not real pleasure in the what do you say, the cessation, the process of cessation of suffering in the right shoulder, when the what do you say, the suffering is beginning in the left shoulder. So neither of those can then be called real pleasure. Lost.
쿠르케베 셰버차고 스탄다 쿠르데 차네데 페베티게 하고도 대화랑 semba 데메도 베티르기야다.
So you can understand through this example of just switching the load from one shoulder to the other.
다야 데스도 아카소레. 게데 동해랑 semba 요레 삼네로 동해랑 semba 요레세. 요나야 대화되게 봐 트립네 되는 가지고 하고요 말했으나 삼나스기요도 네 소소게 동에 렉바르 시지 넘베 대화 매반에서 소소게 올이야 동에 시지는 동계게 대화지 요 말했어도 디시도 안 되게.
So here there's an assertion that real suffering exists but is not apparent because pleasure conceals it. So the meaning of this section is explained in the outline on 309, where it says common beings do not have pleasure that can effectively override pain. We're talking about ordinary beings or common beings. Well,
대외 요달 메토나서 소소기회 동해에 랑셈바 대화랑 셈바 요래데 소소기회 동해 되게 가서래 어디서 동해랑 셈바 요매장하세라 소소기회 동해 되네 서로 대화함 요바다르제네 메토나 동해를 톱셰베 대화 요고나서 알레 동해데 그래서 네가 저래. 이번 소소교회 동에 레바르 시기는 베는베 대화 매반에서 어디 랍사랑하니. 걔들 동해랑 선바 여장하세 편자 가르나. 너는 신내래 다 동해랑 선바 여장 교회 명은 신나세. 소소교회 동에네 대외 요다를 메토나세. 강계 동에 집교르바 대화시자 지엠스타 동에 바 매서 동계게 대화시 숙청부지 요 말에서도
So here the verse 48 then reads, if common beings do not see suffering because pleasure disguises it, why is there no pleasure which obscures suffering? So there's for common beings then there's no pleasure that completely overpowers suffering.
Saturve Zawa that the Daging Azuchi Lam did out. Saturve Zawa Chive Sashinse. Somebody check out the Zara Mabuke Serdo. And they could tell a journey. It's out to the Zizi that in the Sadia Kichi Katukeris, you are. Tell a Jude or Ressa. And Toma won a true chamber. Nyabata said, the one could do so, Yagat and ya tilia nyek de yo de lep de yo de sigora ngone toji chembu ta pacho ngotene ene toji chembu so nujin ta mimayira ne ba gen getinde ka ta de yo de se tengene transit to ba baba sta wone ma tikba je transit sa yung gore de ko tung je je tel cha ji shen ji cha ji ko da de yo de se tengene transit te baba nyang ba la shen ba shi sigora 대화를 생각하신도 다고 야고 예 삼제 transit 통제 기부 예 삼대고 데 기베 내주게 면도 하시고라 땡땡 오데 야유 강걸 단데 년가 요 야래 되어라 대화를 생각하신도 집안 남자 어디 나시 집안 남자 코아르 친외 랑쟁게 랑쟁게 대세 코에 칭제지 레던 녀몽바게 치 대변도 가와가와레도 가르도 하고요 말와 랑쟁게 대바나시 लेगी वंग को दे उंग रेसोरा काबे दे केबा दे ट्रम्बा दे जाने केबे ट्रम्बा लुंग से केबा दे ट्रम्बा नशी दिना मा लुंग से छेदो केवे ले के जा दुर्वे केवे ले के जा दुर्वे जावाला जुबे ठोकबा से ता जुसर जरा दे जा दरबजिल जुसर दे केवे ले के चेको तो से देसर जरा रेस गोरा वो ने गेसों की चीज़ नहीं से वो ने तब रोज़ रोज़ गेसों ने वायु दा तुम रोज़ रोज़ तू की ये सलमान साया ने का योरवा मैंने न्यूमो बे तो से तक बात सिद्धा न्याक बात सिद्धा वो दिया ये दे बे अने मेमा इंद्र बतंडे यहाँ को उन्हें बच्चों के ये बेकेशरा पर न्यूमो ले चाचा दो आते न्यूमो कोंडूंगा जेटा डॉलर सो बतंडे शेंजालो सो मैंने न्यूमो बे तो से न्याक बे से सादुरवा सावा नमी की चिवे साशिं बसे सादुरवा देखो लेज नमी की चिवे साशिं बसे सोचो लेज नमी दी चौसो ना ये मासांडो है रे दियोरा सादुरवे सावा नमी की चिवे चिज़ी देखो लेज नमी दी चौसो गिरिश चाचा चिवे साशिं बा ये तो वाला सेबे ट्रांजिट से ये तो वाला चाकबा दे ट्रांजिट ठीक बा योंदे को आवदे शिंबुदु समको सादे दे ये तो वाला शेंजी चाकबा दे चिगे वाले सर ट्रांजिट रो न्यांगबा ला टेंबा यहाँ तेदान ड्रावे से तुंगे मादो तेवा रंग से बच्चों से जा मैं तो से होती रहता होती चीज़ तो दूसरी लम्बे टोस्ट तीन देवते चिलम दिख दो
So then there's a good example here. Similar, we had this kind of example previously where somebody's falling down a well and there's snakes at the bottom and so forth. But this is more detail where the man is pursued by an elephant, falls into an old well, and halfway down he catches hold of some grass there, but there's a rat sort of gnawing away at the grass, and below there's a large snake waiting for him, and there's like huge pythons coming from the sides, and then meanwhile he's absorbed in tasting honey that's dripping down from above, and he thinks of that as pleasure. But then so the example, what this exemplifies is, or the analogy then is explained here by saying that the, childish beings or ordinary beings then in cyclic existence are pursued by the elephant of death here, not knowing where they're going to be reborn, what kind of karma they're going to, is going to ripen in the future, in their future life. So then, falling into the well of old age, they stop their fall halfway by catching hold of the grass roots of the virtuous karma. Then below, the snake of bad rebirths, or unfortunate rebirths, lie in wait, and the pythons of disturbing emotions, meaning the afflictions of ignorance and attachment and hostility and jealousy and so forth, are writhing towards the person from all sides, and the rat of maturation of the karma is gnawing away at the couch, at the grass roots of the life of this person's life. So then they absorbed in tasting honey drops of craving for attractive objects, just sort of in the middle of all this. They're craving after attractive objects. Then how could this be considered real pleasure when it's only real suffering? Wow.
Oh yeah, that did it. That kasre. Iba tenasigdwa. Tombe da desigdwa. Then lutene tunge jirang shinje tende yena. Ni sanje chomden de tunge jirang shires sungwe ke yo marwa sigwara. Ko nima sabode nima sabores labgo mudwa ko ago yara. Ko senasigwara. Dina dwa kede tunge jirang shin yena tombe lu tunge du sungbala. Goba mebar jude nisen troshe teme goba shino shenase o tijilabda tende samgyora de dunge rashene dunge karsongure to ko nyima sabres la ko marwa tinashirese tenda mendwa seres.
So our skeptic is coming up with a new assertion here. If the body's nature were suffering, it would be unnecessary for the teacher to say that the body is suffering. Just as there's no need to point out that the sun is hot. If it's the nature of something, then everybody would know it.
Ngaranzo soso jo to tunge jirangshi bada hago yo marese o timu gi wange ne timado bache de dewa rangshi yin sam shenji cha ne te wange de ne ko kwa kurgi warese te sonza tombe te ne dezu kanga tunge jirangshi re kira shenda shenja che ne te tonda lenge basa ne kwa kor de gi warese te hago ye tonda le sungi warese 그 차대 매도 시에서 제라더니 동해를 대화르시네 대달이야 착바다 대화 매배 왕게 과국이 와래서 소소이께고 땡자대서 소소이께고리야 어디를 현자 방고래서 대왕게 되는 과국이를 동해 용교를 송거래서 예발 대신 식남게 티모 군제 타마르 송생 알레 디슬랍다 signitilabda.
Right. So, and this is 149, right? So here the answer is there is no such fault, for though the body's nature is suffering, it's because of confusion that one does not realize it, and thinking of it as pleasurable, one circles in cyclic existence. Here the point is that we're attached then to these sources of suffering, and this constantly keeps us out of our ignorance. We're attached to these sources of suffering. Confusion here means ignorance, and so then we're being enjoined then to give up our attachment to sources of suffering, and so sikje de loga da
no sikje sloga da que do chade medo she so so ke tanja dese ko tunge rangshin na tunge rangshin bala tewe rangshin zengi warese kende sanje ge ne ke so so ke ole ke tunge rangshin tele ya ane tewe rangshin do zene chakba da tawa meba te wange ane nyomo ge ste shama do sonde lesane ko ko ne tunge nyang de ge warese o tinde so so ke namla tembares wara ngebar deshin shek namge timu kunji tamar sonse ngone chene kowe tenene lula soba tezuko tunge rangsan ba de jungne rese o te ma shin bije de tawa ngone ji jungne shi bije yesam shenji chakba de ene 미시베드네 타셰데레스 독슈데레스 디아하마고데 독슈데레스 어티송교아레스 데모 꾼게 타마르 송세데.
So the verse then reads, common beings or ordinary beings must be told, you're not free from attachment to suffering. Here the Buddha is saying that out of recognizing that out of confusion that beings are attached to the sources of suffering, thinking, oh, these are sources of pleasure. So then the next part says, certainly Tathagatas therefore have said, this is the worst confusion of all the kinds of ignorance. This is the worst of all.
Pena Sura, Dende Chade, Pena Tanchi is Yobu Chigrava, and the Lega Chede, call Lega Maja Lutanji dead in Bura. Tena Amadi Yonja, I take in the Maji Sosu Lega Kari Sung de Unati Sung Jetose, lying better. Teneco Susan over the Amagat and the Sido subject, they do. Magical Pumbuman, he said, Pumbuji, Namajil, Lagwajuish Timbre. And you can miss what I thought the Maju should do. Kangason, I think I sung good soon there. What did I see Jaco? Don't see my but don't hear and see Baleco, don't hear and see to Zide or membership. What did I see this? So Timugi Chijulo to somewhere. Don't bet Tungi, Tungela Yingo, Geshe. Loban Jados, the old Lamnam Dundua. Soon as a major comes soon at the legward, soon as Yeshe Mado, She Mado, Shindu, Joe Timugi, Chinjilogi, soon alase, Chinjiloco, mentioned the cook down the soon de Yora. What is on the co? There were Dungerans and by Geshe de Letevarans and Basung de Ade, or the Mishiba Sungiores. Don't bet Tungela Yin or Geshe, Sungbar Longer Jados, or the Teda Shashi Tunga Mambuno de Varetile, Tunga Manuet and Dalteda Shanja, Ponche Sungiores.
So the example is very good. Taking her wages, a servant girl did only half the work and then left it. Her mother told her that whatever she took hold of, the mother came along and found that she had only done half. So then the mother wanted to give her some good advice and to finish up her work once she took responsibility for it. So she said her mother took hold of it, and her mother told her that whatever she took hold of, she should hold on tight, meaning, whatever you undertake, you should undertake it seriously, right? But she took it literally. Then one day she took hold of a donkey's tail, and though others told her not to hold on, she did not let go, but repeated, whatever you take hold of, hold on tight. So it's just similarly, the teacher instructed those in the grip of confusion's error, right? That you're who cling to the idea of suffering as pleasure, to develop aversion to suffering, we're holding on to the sources of suffering, thinking they're pleasure, and the Buddha is instructing us to develop an aversion for suffering.
Moya, tande sumba duchi je tunge kumju se ti shekdwa. Duchi tunge ta tunge chida tunge sumyora. Tunge ji tunge jure tunge chaban duchi tunge. Ta tunge sidusa ko kadu ina ko gajabado tena ko tunge re de orno. Tanda tunge ko kaje debina tunge ji tunge se. Tundu yaje hakon go na ya da chi na za ji shuba da de chwa tunge de ngazu kanga tundu yaje tunge hako edra. Tunge ji tunge se. Jure tunge se de kore sakje ji chwa de da da ngazu ma bu shemba. O kange re chi ye che ti me ba che de ene ta de wa re samsam lo me. Delia de wa se yora. Sakje ji de wa se kore de wa de ya. Nyemo wa ge le de nyemo wa che. O de delia jure tunge se. Ko daga ne mar ko jurne dunge re du yorno jure dunge chaban duji dunge se chwa tanyum Dani ti maige tu kanga chaban du chi dunges. La da nyamu be wang ge chungwe. Sakji chi pumbu do tu kanga ta kam sungal yo ba. Sungam sungme ndongam kangal yo ara chaban du chi dungete. Senshi so de so tang nyum ta sha ne de ge do. Mo tele chaban du chi dunges ge do.
So here the topic is explained for verse 50 here is how to meditate on the pervasive suffering of conditioning or conditionality. There are three types of suffering. Before we talked about the first two, which is the suffering of pain, which is all animals know this. Everybody we know that just if we get sick or if somebody hits our body with something, this is just feeling of pain. Then the next one is suffering of change, which is what we've been talking about, just sort of that we've been trying to, the assertion has always been trying to establish that it's some kind of real pleasure, but in fact, it's just an alleviation of pain, and then we sort of exaggerate that as being pleasure, and then that pleasure is really contaminated. It's the feeling of happiness, but it's the feeling of pleasure, but it's contaminated pleasure, and therefore it just fades. It changes into suffering. So then that's the suffering of change. Then the final one is this pervasive suffering of conditionality, which pervasive said because it pervades all the three realms of existence, desire, form, and formless, and it's the feeling of kind of a, we call it neutral feeling. You kind of have there's feeling of pain, feeling of pleasure, and then this kind of a neutral feeling, neither pain nor pleasure, and but it's the suffering that we being under constantly being under the influence of our former karma and disturbing emotions, or afflictions, or people call them different. What do you say? Sometimes the newer terms are like destructive emotions is also very useful. So.
Ade chaban doji yidunge komjuni sedwa. Kede lu medagba yeme ge dewa yodoshna lu medagba da de jura chenre. Ina ko dewa de ran zambachi yore samna sedwa lulia. O tene medagba la ngebar ne sedwa. O de yoba mende se nami ji lula sokba medagba kan la sedwa. Medagba la se le da nyumo be Namile trube me lui nada, don't lui nada, lui de sigora. Nami you lui medava kala sigora. Medav pala, never nurse. Oh, go medava sonja con jigber jibe juchigi, and then nebardo never chene, and jigber cigarette, sonjako, ye junior cheba kanlas, ye joatene, tele never junior cheba kanlas sigora. Kala. No, you tete means, yin give Chenyi Chenji and a Karsore never yoba tell us, Sanjani Pumbu tell us water, and Dawa members could eventually make Maris water. Teacher Sakbatan Chebe, Mitaba Kayan Batella, Tamje, Tunga Sheshavan Euros, Led and Yomo Bawan get Trube, and a Kichi Kinji Chengi Lulu Soba Kayan Batella, and a Dunga was a wood escadwa.
So, the assertion here in this section is that though the body is impermanent, it is pleasurable. And the answer is that is not so. The impermanent if we read the verse, then 50, the impermanent is definitely harmed. What is harmed is not pleasurable. Therefore, all that is impermanent is said to be suffering. So, if we look at the commentary here, whatever is impermanent, like the body, which is the maturation of contaminated past actions and disturbing emotions, or destructive emotions, however you like to think of it, is definitely damaged by factors. What is it damaged by? By factors such as disintegration. It's constantly disintegrating, and therefore produces aversion. We have some kind of disgust or dislike, right, for it. Then, so anything affected by causes of harm, whose character is to produce aversion, is not pleasurable. We can't call that. When we say anything, it's talking about Sakche Nirlingi Pumbo. It's it means that these contaminated 5 aggregates that are appropriated by our former actions and our destructive emotions. So here, anything affected by causes of harm, whose characters to produce aversion is not pleasurable. So therefore, we can basically say our body and mind is not pleasurable. Therefore, all that is impermanent and contaminated is said to be suffering.
This one. Oh yeah. Oh, they do that also there. When they saw the door. Just this selection. They don't do what they did work also. Yeah. Haha. Midabala never knew Sierra. Honey, Kala knew you take me Sierra. This is Midagayamba. Tamje Dungeshe Yusudwa. Midaba Kain, but they tamje dung our resigua. The Midaba Kain, but they tamje dung our resate. Let and Yumba get you Sakje Midaba Kain, but they dung our resigua. Chida Midaba tamje dung our resigua Mara. Sanji Kusun to you and there to Mitawa ready or no. They dung our Kemarwa. Or Tandangazo, they would and one day. Cassia. Midaba Kaimba. Chile, Sabada Chebe, Midaba Kaimba, Dunga was a dog. Oh, did Lagura. Midaba Yena, Dunga in Benga by Omara. Tandangazo Colene, Longelus, Wako, Denge. There's a letter and Yamon on conjuration to Guara. Or Dilet and it, Dunga in Guara.
So to reiterate what the import is here, it's that it says that therefore all that is impermanent is said to be suffering. Here, you might think it's said to give rise to suffering. Is it another way of, because there's a difference between the two words Dungel and Dungel Wa, and it's Dungel Wa. Geshe made this distinction earlier. So if you have trouble with thinking it, it's said to be suffering, just remember when it says like that, it means give rise to suffering. So then also when it says all that is impermanent, it's not everything that is impermanent, because like a Buddha's perfect form, for instance, is impermanent, and that's not suffering. So it's really talking. You have to also be adding this qualification, which is added in the last sentence of the commentary there in that first paragraph, where it says contaminated means produced by former actions and afflictions. Okay, former karma and afflictions.
That's all. Oh, the Indico, Tandangarazo, Koyane, Lu Longula Soba, Tishaja Shegiora. Oh, the Koyap and the Luta Buteaco, or Ladan Yamubange, Ko Tikiorno. Or Tisunzako, Dungawa se she de luda bu dungawa de when did you learn you shawaji in bichare? When did you penji de la dan yamu wangia ni lu nyawa yeda tan rukanga ne lu lonju kanga tigara. Sa dungawa yende when did you let dan yamu be shawachre? Kaze de do me na do yo karji do dan de ke mar koran kande lel ko netina shire ndura. When did you learn you shawaji in bichare? Tada nyebe so jiten chebe chers. Tada ko jewa geba nawa chiwa kazisa na shita lugi jewa ganga lula ko tubiya ta lugi naza ta chi jindel ten yongu dwa. Jeza ko saje nyele pumbuta ude dunga wa yende tada nyebe so jiten chebe chers. Jewa ganga dunga ganga ka shi chigi wares. Wenji ju leda nyomo be shangwa chen ko kaze de do me tende ke yo marwa. O de dunga wa so de samgu wara.
So then, if we sort of make it into a logical statement, then we have to say that any of the world's places of resources and bodies are all give rise to suffering because they're under the power of former karma and afflictions. So then there's once contaminated in that way, then we can say that any of our samsara's places, bodies, and resources are give rise to suffering because they are the basis for they act as the basis for suffering. So
oh yeah. Oh, the indico midak base. The shunale, tisir medale dungesigua. Midak by imbecina, dungevares. Dungewa imbecina, damevares. What in this tugiora?
So then it is generally stated then that due to being impermanent, then things give rise to suffering. Because these things give rise to suffering, then they are selfless.
No, dameba.
Selfless. Yeah, dameba.
Dameba kare.
Selfless.
Oh yeah. What did this? Oh, the indico, pumbunga dabute. When did you let a young bewangiko? Gishi says a conjuration ready orba. What did you let a young bewangi? Duration gecko medava sonza. So our
medal so our impermanent body and mind then will give rise to suffering then because they're always under the influence of former karma and afflictions, and so that's what is meant here by saying that anything that's impermanent is suffering, right? But because what is impermanent? Impermanence gives rise to suffering.
Oh, that and that. Let the nyumu bewangi, ane duration geje sonza. Ane ko yaga de duga yaga cheje ko let the nyumu bewangi duration yuza. Ko dungeji rashi chere sigora. This is medale dungese. Chamanam de kapso. This is medale dunges. Medaba sonza dungewares. Sa medaba se de medaba kangal sigmare sanje da bagbe medaba tezu yoris te lepsara. Cheza medaba lenyo je shawa chenje. Let the nyumu be shawa chenje. Shang le ju let the nyumu be wange duro chenge ki medaba kaye bate. Ane dungewares.
Yes. So then if we look at Dharmakirti's statement, it's really Dharmakirti who put this statement of let's say from impermanence, suffering, from suffering selflessness. So then if we, as we stated before, it's not all instances of impermanence. So it's talking about things that are constantly changing because they're under the influence of our former actions and afflictions. So anything that's under the influence, anything impermanent under the influence of former actions and afflictions, then is suffering, gives rise to suffering.
No, this on the go, Lanyu Yuangi, Midabada, and Dungawa Imbishana, Pumbungata with it. Midabada, Dungawa Imbishana, Rawaja Maris, Gora, Dungawa Shawaja, couldn't think on the Kishikishi when you watch it, and it Dungawa Rangshiche. Oh, do you do Pumbungalia, round the Dayon Shingimaris, Damevares, Gora.
Yes. So then, anything that's suffering, then, if we continue, is under the influence of former karma and afflictions, and therefore is selfless, because you can't have a self-sufficient or independent self in this case, that because it's dependent upon former actions and afflictions.
That's right. Yeah, that because oh yeah, Tangani di Maloshana. Oh yeah, don't did it. Penacasura. When you dishawajangi, Midaba Kain, but they don't have a resero. Penas pedalia, Lenze, and Jungunsu, Kangalua, Lenza Jandu Jurashinos. Oh, Pena Sagu Tamju Chundavichi Dinarba, Lenza Satiswara, Sagu engaged Chuna, Karilung Benako, Sagu Regua, or Dinashin Resgora. Yes. Let them Yumuge, Chumbe Saji Pumbukai, but they don't have a Ranshima, don't Rosio Maris.
So then anything that's impermanent then and under the power of former karma and afflictions is suffering or gives rise to suffering. And the example given here is that anything that falls into a salt pit becomes salty. So that's clear. Anything that's in a salt pit is necessarily going to become salty. Well,
didn't do Chinago, Medabada, doing our Nibude, pay a watch some tension and the Damilko, a level of Chagiwara. Medabala Assembly Abukona, let the Yamubuang Pumbu Medabala Samlokona, and the Dungawa Yabuko Chagre. Dungawa Yenda Yellow de Yabu Samlokosona, Damebal Koyabu Chagre.
Yes. So it's if we think over impermanence and suffering well, we think about it carefully, then it's not difficult for us then to understand selflessness. That if we see that how we're under the influence of other factors, then it's easy for us then to understand how the self is not independent.
No, they do Midabada. Dunga Mambo Samla Tansuna, and they may share Kumje Dunga Dunga to the dead and the Marwa. Oh, Midabada Dunga, the Abu Samla Kosona, and they may Yingdu Chambo. Oh, Tende Gurkiara.
Yes. So don't think of the contemplation or thinking a lot, reflecting a lot about impermanence and suffering as being something that'll make you just sort of more what's the word for us? More give us more difficulties and make us feel oppressed. And it's not to do for a feeling like that. It's to help us to to feel more courage.
No, can there is a medaba casing as we do so? Can I chew yam sembas, chew a medaba, ragwe medaba, the allocation much the more chatawakajima. Can I chew yam semba, can I never you was it? Can you jiba yon dande, and Chidala college says one. About is Chomeda someday again. College yams the calling ever you have 2 tawarish or Nachingere, some of the Kogi Kogene, Lagachavinas, College yams the calling ever you give. Then in Jigba Yonda, there's a call. Jigbatani, social Jigbatan, Tendek, Jigba Yungumaris, and Jigba Yonzo stand to this water. Garrison, Chida Shinjilan, Shigmaris, Tachina came. Oh, Mesa de Bay, I was carrying shirt today. I wish I have somebody Changi Chonso, Chamba, so Bay, I would just debate in the Same, Namasabe, the Well Shagbachevi, Mesa, I was carrying some coining to Blegiora. Chidale, Shele, Shigiomare. Oh, then Shenja Chons do Yore. Oh, that you do it Chonso Tanga, Jomerson, Comjene, She's a number shot to make it in the Yungomara. Do you understand us one?
Yes. So this is clear in the final verse of the first chapter, where it said, "Whoever with certainty has the thought, 'I am going to die,' having completely relinquished attachment, why would they fear even the Lord of death?" So at the point of your death, if you've been thinking, when you think about impermanence, this is coarse impermanence, and we're not even talking about subtle impermanence. When you're thinking about coarse impermanence, and you come to this understanding that I'm going to die, it's not to make us kind of feel discouraged, because what it helps us to do is to develop virtuous states of mind, amass good karma, or constructive action, constructive karma, and then have virtuous states of mind like love, compassion, and so forth, to improve ourselves in that way, and then when we are facing death, then we've reduced our attachment that time, so then we can face our death with the Lord of Death here, but face our death, confidently.
No, because Zulaiba, the depend on Mirosina. Oh, that. Chome Dabache, Tandanyam Dungazo, Legong and Duty. So, some. Tadeziranga, Yawichi Tagore, some chamba that Sawache, Kondumaje, Seva Comje, Yawiche, Messikia would some Shusham Kura. Oh, Tico, Namila, Tongalamada, Namis of the Kanga Yawiche Taco, did Chema, Tapsi Chema, Semde Cheke or Marisam. Deziranga, this substitute or Semde Chenti Duchera. She said to carry some dish or a Tata Yomara. Oh, did Namidan Yakuche, Messidi Yakuche carrying some Jovache Yomara.
So then, just like we discussed in an answer to a question the other day, if we then are very kind, what we treat our relatives, well, with real care and love and compassion, and have a good attitude, then when we reach the point of our death, then we will have nothing to regret at that time.
Oh yeah, that dunga wadele yondan karyosene, shenya dunga yondan nesjara. Kwe chakwa sewa chische. Nezuganga ngone rwa kota suyo marwa. Ngone kwe nere diora kwa kanzu luda neta kanga de semkyo kwe nere diora. Odi inde shenya dunga yondan kwe chakwa sewa chische. Susu dunga wa yondan yilu samlutande ngaje da kengba da tende yungumara semliya. Tanga kwa kote or let and you shama to you. So would the dead is long a day or something, simply conarich order. My dear King Bamaviche. Go ahead, check what's our chesido. My dear Jabo, Shibjis and Penjoda, Luda Chicken get on my kitchen biomara. Some Jonar of Chiche, check what shown to Yara. Shaya to me, and then to me Sambe. yonde karyosana chidi sem jobo rapchiche ane kong nga ge da tinde sel dugre swa to te basa warche stitch la tale
so then there's also so then what are the benefits, I guess we could say, or the good or the advantages of thinking over suffering in the way that we have been? Then in the second chapter, then we have to think what are the advantages of that is that if we think deeply about suffering in this way, then what happens is that we have I guess you can say a mind of disenchantment, and this we become disenchanted with cyclic existence, and no longer we sort of have the pride that I've done so much, I'm so what a wealthy or beautiful or successful or something. You don't. What it does is that it reduces your pride and well, basically, the advantage is to reduce your pride or sort of self-inflation, and thinking about suffering. So then, also another advantage is that we will have compassion for others. We think about how they're in the same situation as we are, under the influence of this terrible suffering. So then they're just like me. So then you develop a strong feeling of compassion.
Kwabal niji kila kashi tilen semcharo da kya yabu togure tungegi jude mikiware tichinu pangure tere jude kya re samje kya duel kabo mecinal ko nyiri na kya duel kabo mikiwa tunge pangelia kaboriwa kila kashi tilen sems kya duel kabo to ne cho da de tere jude togure sam de tungegi jude kagure samje zemgiro sarsoche.
Yes. So then you become much more conscientious and careful about this is another good quality or advantage, is you become more conscientious and careful about avoiding or abstaining from any non-virtuous actions, any destructive actions, and then you do whatever you can to cultivate virtuous actions with the knowledge that it's what do you say, non-virtuous karma that gives rise to suffering, and then it's virtuous karma that gives rise to happiness.
Ane tose tan di mandi da chi medebra chungba yinaya koya rangshin de tungegi rangshin chere yaga de chel duga de yongir kola rangshin nyamdo re samsange samlu korto gura mebe baro shibuchi bisibra shibuchi ngai tole chung samlu korki marwa.
So then the advantage of thinking about impermanence and suffering is that then when difficulties and adversity happen, and we face adversity and various difficulties in our lives in cyclic existence, then that time we just will understand, well, this is just the way things are. This is just the nature of being reborn into cyclic existence.
Yeah. The end. Kadu ina ko namsa sem chuk chocho. Sem migi ba che chocho. Tende yongi omare. ye me de wa ji zaman de chung de zane ye me de wa ji semba me de a ta cham ngal shi chung su samda ane ye me de wa yong gora de yo no ko de mang sha de shen sha go yong gora shen sha wang to sin de o den de ma sung sam je ye me de wa chung ne kon du sa ba ane ra pung shen pung nyok de chen bu su yo ra o ye me de wa de kontra se yin se re kala ya bu sen so ko to chim sha ga ba yi me de ta ma de ya bu de sa ne kontra sa bo me ga ga ja de ja ka ga yong ge ra yi me de se ni ne she dan de ta jom so jom me jom ka ga ne ba je ge do
so then so then if we're thinking about suffering and impermanence in this way, then and we're met with difficulties, it doesn't disturb our minds. We don't get, very unhappy and discontent. And it's discontent, this kind of, sometimes translated in different ways, but being unhappy or discontent or, I forget some of the other ones, but is just is the food of anger, okay? And it's, so this discontent really arises because we feel attachment to we're feeling attachment, and so the thinking about thinking about impermanence and suffering then lessens our attachment, so we don't feel this discontent. But if we discontent is the basis for us, then if we don't reduce our attachment and we do feel this discontent, then the discontent serves as the basis of us getting angry, because it's the food of anger, and then when we so we're always ready just to fight, and we just sort of what we do is we start ruining our own life and ruining the lives of others, and out of this getting so basically we might probably say upset, right, when we meet with adversity. So we don't go down that path, okay? If we concentrate, what do you say? Reflect well on impermanence and suffering.
Tari tanda pe di me mato soso de yore, soso saya tunga kuya ne yore, tamane kanga shaa jen rujure, nima chidi kanga shaa rujure, ta tari dozi shaa ku chungre, halaya ke yo marti ko ali tindi kanga liyongi yore, yongsi bare samche, suyo tupudwa. Samba meji wa sheba chaja pe de nyudu chik marwa.
So, then, if we're able to think along this way, then we can have about impermanence and suffering and come to understand them as the nature of cyclic existence. Then, for instance, if we're met with like some kind of misfortune, okay, like somebody, it's possible that somebody could steal all your wealth, and you could be completely bankrupt, and then if you're able to reflect on how things are in cyclic existence, you remember impermanence, that the end of being accumulating wealth is that you have to give it up. You can just, it could happen at your death, but it could happen anytime. So then you just understand, well, this is just as it said, that although anything you accumulate, the end of that is that you have to give it up. So what that does is prevents you from getting really upset and unhappy and discontent, and you're able to bear such difficult times and the suffering that they incur.
mission that you go, Kiran Duja Lagusido, Duja Resigi, Tamyan Chane, Yimedia Mamuyongara, or the Keji sheds and some Lutangiora. Wotako di Kongaya Wures and Angaya Rundrea Mare, Duja Resanga Durundrea Margara Yani Karin the Teletegrisam. Oko Keji Lavding Alpenike Mesam Tonga, Lumbetonga, the Tata when I should Tata said yes at a Keo Mare. Tile Pende Yawures and Payake Mare, in Angara, some Gishinjachi or Mado. Oh, Tileco. To na kala palichi sayachuna ti pemba ngone pemba yora sikdi pemba ke yo mare so sem ke se ma de chi se tamnya da lungdung lungita lungbe tong benal tata bane tata se de me re sara hale ke yo mare sam se to ge ora.
So then there's also the kind of suffering that we get from people saying something bad about us or trying behind our backs, backbiting and so forth. These kinds of things give us a lot of trouble. Oh, he said that or she said that. We're thinking then we hold on to it. It actually, no matter whether people say good things or bad things, it doesn't really affect you. It's not something. It's just like you can think of it as like wind or some kind of sound in a great empty, vast place. It just you can't. At that point, you're not thinking that it really has. The only way that it affects you is that if you get some kind of what do you say? If you give it some thought, if you hold on to it and give it some thought, but if you just let it go by, then this won't affect you. Well.
Oh, did I go? Lamgaraji Chaba Mambutan Sumoda Jazz Tamadera Changchung Mambu Yongiora. I think they do Garazo Contra Sabashagua. I didn't give too much Yungdo. But there's a Randeleco, so Resara. Don't Chang to the coast, Serna. Some trucks in our younger Kayomari, younger sometimes to the younger Samna, Kayomara. On the Church Chunju, so no Church Chabina. And it no again among we're 1,000 do that in 1,000 tin, and then Semba Miji among Buchayora. Semba Tas, today you could do it down in Seba. Alanga do the college and what then recovery number recovery them, the recovery motor, Gagri, recovery Chava Tagre, Dotu Marley, and the young cigarette Samna. Okay, Omara, don't it Alicia. Tax the Chagore. Tax my nurture and energy among 1,000 do the Kanga Semla and the Miji Buchayora.
So also, it's possible that when we're traveling, whether by car, plane, bus, that there's a lot of difficulties that we meet with in these kinds of, in our various undertakings, and so then, if that time we just think, instead of like. Finding it unbearable, we bear it just by any kind of difficulty, thinking, oh, this is just the way things are in cyclic existence. Always, we're going to meet with something, that is difficult and what do you say, unattractive and difficult for us. That's just the way it is, and so you don't get upset and because it's the discontent or upsettedness that then forms a basis for anger and then all the problems ensue from that.
Oh yeah, simple. Sent to which you do, don't change sent to which sent to which send Chunju in and Chunju Chunju Mambu Nugri and December Media.
If you're able to bear harm, then whatever happens won't affect you. If you're unable to bear harm, then even the smallest harms will more or less harmful things will make you very unhappy and cause you difficulty.
Oh, that and that. Do you Kwasonza ko Tandrik Vicanja Yoma, Tandrik Vichin Diva de Togajuan de Cochuni Eva, or Chuni in the Togajuchuna. Bichunjuna sumba kedicho so yona ne tela mega chechi kos kedicho so mena ne tela mega chechi pens dogare chonso na tadi yangja sobje ja do na semde ma je yangja ko sobje ja tabshi chi sobje ja me ba ji cha cha ne jala re la na la sa ne ra ya mena to semde jen jonggang jong ba kedicho so men tela mega chechi pens pendo kare yusho tasul ra na ra kesa chi ko i pento ba sho sam zo ju ne da ra ba ite semde jen tonda ke yo mara 어디 삼는 남기네 당고도와 초가세도 코카리나 로디 메제날이야 사바베 기부제 대대 계신버리도 준준나 송다 질라밥냐 다게네 섬지랍다 녀메자스 다딩메디 망부 용거데 가에 섬지 쭉 메자스라 섬조네는 소소 강에서구라 단디메디 망부 용거레 멜람나시 니세사선 차스 요쇼 삼나 켈상 요서로 어디엔데코 초냠네 생겨서 창의충이 지금 남산네 쳐줘다 근데 내가 샘바자 침부려 구양보되지 그뒤에나 샘시디지 나와 베트로보시 땡게고 있어라
So essentially what we're talking about here is that for a practitioner of the Dharma, it's most important to keep your mind happy and peaceful and calm. So that's the most important thing. So when you're met with any difficulty, then you don't let it change your inner peace, your calmness, and to just sort of be relaxed about things and the most helpful way of doing that is to remember the words of Shantideva, and that anything that happens, what do you say, Gaute Trisha Yunani de la Miga Jishikpen. If any difficulty happens, if there's some way of amending it or changing it, or what do you say, some way of solving the problem, then why get unhappy? Okay, if you can think of some way of dealing with it, and then go ahead and deal with the problem. Then if there's no way of amending it or correcting it, or what do you say, changing the situation, then why get unhappy? It's not going to be helpful to you. For instance, if you lose your bag, and if the airlines loses your bag and they can't get a hold of it anywhere, then why make yourself unhappy? It's just that's just, you just said, well, that's just the way things are in cyclic existence. There's always going to be something difficult or what do you say, or something that gives you difficulty happening. So then just don't let it affect you.
Oh yeah, that did you do it?
Didn't we finish our appointed amount of time? Yeah, okay. That sounds like.
Oh, then it's on the doing matter.
So then it's a good time to end then.